Welcome to the Hey Boomer podcast, the show that inspires listeners to know that we are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. Each week we have extraordinary guests, thought leaders, and active, engaged people who share their insights with us. This week we spoke with Faye Fulton. She is the Chief Storytelling Officer and Chief Executive Officer of a boutique communications firm. And it's all about telling powerful stories that will inspire your business audience. My name is Wendy Green, and I am your host for Hey Boomer.
Hello, Hey Boomer listeners. Let's see. So today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and it's a really important day to recognize a very visionary leader who led nonviolent demonstrations during the civil rights movement. And I think it's so important for all of us at this time in our nation's history to be inspired by leaders like Dr. King, who led us to see greater potential, to see possibilities, and to denounce the violence that we're seeing and believe in the possibility of America. And it's my hope and prayer that January 20th, we do have a peaceful transition of power. So I just wanted to put that out there to start today. Last week, we talked to our guest about writing our own books or having one ghostwritten for us. And today we're going to learn about good storytelling. And I emphasize the word good because a powerful story, a powerful good story can make so much difference in how it is received and how you can inspire your audience to take some action that you want them to take, to listen, to think about the services that you're offering. So I'm sure that we all have stories, favorite go-to stories that we like to share. You might want to take some notes during this conversation to learn ways that you can actually improve those stories and to make them more interesting for your audience. And so that your friend or your spouse isn't saying, yeah, I've heard that one already. So pay attention to the messages that Faye is going to give us today. And you might even be interested in connecting with her later on to help improve a story for a presentation that you have. I also wanted to let you know, do y'all remember CJ Golden? She was my guest, and we talked about Taoism, aging, and caregiving. Well, CJ and I are going to co-host a podcast that will be starting live on Thursdays in the first week in February at 1:00. And the title of that is The Caregiver's Bakery. So I'll tell you more about that as we go along, as we, the weeks get closer, but it's basically to help have a conversation with caregivers about ways that you can care for yourself when everybody is telling you, take better care of yourself. And you're like, yeah, I don't know how to do that. So we will be talking about that on the Caregiver's Bakery. Just a reminder that you can find the recording of this show on many of the podcast channels, Spotify, Apple, Google. So if you have friends that you think would benefit from hearing about this conversation that I'm going to have with Faye Fulton today, please be sure and share the link or just point them to the podcast channels and they can download this episode. And we love to see your comments, and hi everybody that's saying hi, and thank you for your comments about my cell phone. I know this is really annoying, but we will get it resolved. Hi, Faye.
Hi, Wendy.
Let me take a moment to introduce you, okay?
Oh, fine.
So Faye Fulton is CEO and CSO, which I love. CSO is Chief Storytelling Officer of a boutique consulting firm specializing in one particular area of communication, business storytelling. Faye has spent more than 2 decades diving into the art and science of storytelling so that she can help others find, craft, and perfect their stories. And today she has a proven process that she can guide you through, and hopefully she'll share some insights with us on this call. She's a sought-after speaker, 22 years of experience delivering keynotes at conferences, association meetings, and business events, and she has conducted workshops in all 50 United States. So Faye, I am so glad that you agreed to be on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me, Wendy. I'm delighted to be here.
It's my pleasure. And Faye is becoming a new friend too. She's new to Greenville.
Yes, I've been here a year and a half.
During the lockdown.
Yes, that's why it doesn't feel like I've been here a year and a half for the
I bet.
crazy year.
So Faye, you have a really interesting backstory of kind of how you became enmeshed in storytelling in your childhood. So would you share that with the audience?
Yes. In fact, right now, I feel like I've come full circle because I got started and got interested in storytelling so early in life. And now that's my career, business storytelling. So I think it's been quite an amazing journey. But my father was a corporate bigwig. He was high up there and he got an amazing promotion. So before I was 6 years old, my family and I moved to Italy. I grew up in Italy.
Nice.
And oh, yeah, I wouldn't trade my childhood with anyone else. It was an amazing childhood and I was just loved it. But that's where I got interested in storytelling. Now, the Italy back then is not the same as Italy today. So back then, there were very few Americans who actually lived in Italy. And when we moved into our neighborhood, and if you've ever been to any major city in Europe, you know that most people live in high-rise apartment buildings. Well, we did too. Our neighborhood was actually 3 apartment buildings. And when I moved in, I was the only American girl in the entire neighborhood. And that's because my sisters were very different from me. I was the tomboy and I was always outside. I was always playing. I met everybody very quickly. Anyway, one of the people in my neighborhood was a retired opera singer, and she was also a contessa. So when I met her, she was approaching 70 at a gallop. She had been retired for some time. But after she retired, she acquired the disease of agoraphobia, which is that disease that doesn't allow you to go out your front door. You stay inside your home. You're just afraid to go outside. So she never left her apartment, but she was often out on her balcony. And that's where we actually met. She had heard about this new American girl. She wanted to meet me, and she called me over one day. Well, after that, she just took me under her wing. She'd never have children of her own, and she treated me like I was her daughter. We had a very special, very close relationship. In fact, I don't know how I could have made it through my childhood without her.
Wow.
And what I'm saying is I just feel so fortunate because growing up, I actually had 2 families. I had my American family, and then my other family was just one person. It was the Italian Contessa. And she's the person who taught me all of my life story lessons. She's the person who taught me about life. Now, don't get me wrong. I love my parents,
Of course.
They're just very different type of people. And my parents were not giving me what I desperately needed. And here's what I mean by that. I don't want anyone to misunderstand. Love my parents. My father's still with us. But my parents were not touchy-feely people. They never talked about emotion. I can't remember my parents ever hugging me. And I was always curious. I still am. I'm a very curious person. But even as a kid, when I asked a question, I really wanted to know the answer. But the answer I'd always get from my parents was, because I said so. And the other way we interacted, my parents did not talk with me. They talked at me.
Mm-hmm.
Dinner's at 7, be home. Have you done your homework? We're leaving early tomorrow. So I just wasn't getting what I really craved. But when I asked the Contessa a question, even if it took an hour to answer, she would answer my question. But she was just so different from my parents. Like most Italians, she was very gregarious, very passionate, very open. She taught me about all sorts of things. She taught me about music, about fashion, about architecture, about cook. She taught me how to cook. She taught me how to sing. Just unbelievable. But how I got interested in storytelling is through her,
Mm-hmm.
because, like I said, when she retired, she never left her apartment. And so her friends came to her. Now, her friends were all these wonderful performers, dancers, musicians, comedians, singers, and these were incredible storytellers. Now, these were also people from all over the world. They spoke different languages. They were from different backgrounds, different cultures. And when they told their stories, I just learned so much about the entire world. You can imagine. It was just an incredible environment.
Oh, it sounds like it. And as a young girl, to be the way you're describing it, to be seen by all of these people, like the Contessa and these great singers and performers, to be seen, not just managed like a small child.
Oh, it was
Awesome.
amazing. These people were incredible. So we were always involved in story. But then something else happened to me. So when we lived in Italy, my father would take a vacation every other year. So he would save up his vacation time. And when he did that, he had the entire summer off. So we would come to the United States to visit my grandparents. So the first time I remember meeting my grandparents, of course, they knew me as an infant, which I didn't remember any of it,
Wow.
But the first time I remember meeting my mother's parents, who lived in Texas, was when I was 8 years old. And my grandfather was retired then. But unlike my parents, my grandfather was a creative person. And when he retired, what he did all day long, he walked around with a paper pad. It was the kind of pad that had the spiral on the top.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote stories all day long.
Wow.
It was amazing. I'd never met him. I didn't know anything about him. And I didn't know he was a storyteller. No one ever told me about that. But my grandfather's stories were very, very different than the type of stories we told in Italy, because they had a twist to it. My grandfather's stories had to rhyme. So he and I would spend hours together rhyming his stories.
How
And
fun,
working
though.
on his stories, because my sisters weren't interested in that, but I was. And then every night after dinner, we'd still be at the dining table. And after we finished dinner, my grandfather would share with all of us the story he had written that day. And they were wonderful. Most of them were hilarious. So I was just at a very early age, I was inundated with story and just was fascinated, just loved it.
What a wonderful opportunity and experience for you. Wow. So, how did you take all of that, which could have just been a love, and recognize there was a real need for this in the business community?
Well, I've been very fortunate with my career. My career has always been centered around communication.
Okay.
And, as I shared with you, the only type of communication I speak about today is business storytelling, because I've niched it to this point. And so I've always been involved in story. I, as you said, I've conducted workshops in all 50 states. And my workshops are always for the corporate world, all day long workshops, but I would always incorporate stories into my workshops. So I've been dealing with stories for years and years. And now, today, it's very unfortunate. And what I mean by unfortunate is, over the last 5 to 7 years, the word story and storytelling have become buzzwords in the business arena. And it's unfortunate because everyone seems to be talking about story, but there are very few people who actually understand what story is or use story correctly. So there is an incredible amount of confusion when it comes to story. And I understand that confusion because story is something we feel close to. When most people hear the word story, they flash back to their childhood. And most children were put to sleep by their parents reading them a story. So we feel like we're very, very close to story and we understand it. But I love what I do, and I love educating people about story because I always see the light bulb go off. When you get the information, things start to fall into place. But if I'm working with a client or if I'm giving a keynote speech, I might be in front of 500, 800 people, but we start talking about business storytelling, and I'll throw out the question to everyone, give me a definition of story. And invariably, the definition I hear is story. Well, story has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
That's exactly what went into my head.
Well, yes, it does. But that doesn't give us any information about what a story actually is. And even a cockroach and Thanksgiving dinner has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So people are just very, very confused. They think they understand story until they try to write one.
So what are some of the distinguishing features that make a mediocre story a really good story?
Well, that's going to be your skill set. Now, I want to be very clear for you and your listeners. There are many different types of stories, but the only type of story we're talking about now is business storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something you have to work with strategically. Okay. So a business story, when you share a story in the business arena, it's very, very different than telling a story for sheer entertainment purposes. So it's going to involve a great number of skills. So if you're a good writer, but you cannot tell your story well, mm-hmm. it's going to backfire. You're going to need an awful lot of skills in the business arena. But storytelling, it is a communication tool. And one of the reasons people are so confused with stories and storytelling in business is because people are trying to use storytelling as a sales tool. Mm-hmm. And it's not a sales tool. It's a communication tool. Mm-hmm. And business today, it's not about closing a sale. It's about opening a relationship. And that's one of the powerful reasons you want to be working with story today, to form connection with your clients, your customers, people on your team, the people you work with, to form connections and to start building relationships. So understanding how to work with story is key. But as you know, story is still a buzzword. And I am absolutely amazed at what people today are calling story. They don't have anything coming close to being a story. They're simply calling it story. Well, this adds to all sorts of confusion.
So I'm a little confused here because you said, well, if you're a good writer, but you don't want to speak it, then you're at a big disadvantage, that we don't understand what goes into making a compelling business story that will build those relationships, open those doors. So can you help us? Can you give me some clarity on that?
Yes, I'll be happy to. What I'd like to share are the 5 types of stories that professionals need to be working with today in business.
Okay.
So the first type of story is what I call the origin story. And the origin story is the origin of your business or your career. Why did you choose the industry or the field you work inside of? And these type of stories will help your clients, your investors, your customers understand whether or not you're worth dealing with. This is all about business. So that's the first type, the origin story. Now, the second type of story professionals need to be working with are what I call the beginning stories. And the beginning stories are stories about your childhood when you learned the life lessons that have made you the person you are today. So, what kind of person are you? Are you an honest person? Are you someone who keeps their word? Are you someone who can be trusted? Well, people don't tend to believe you when you walk right up to them and say, I'm the most honest person God ever put on earth.
Right.
So instead of doing that, it will be much more beneficial for you to tell a story about the kind of person you are. Like maybe you could share a story. You and your brother were out playing baseball one night, and your brother hit a home run, and that baseball flew through your neighbor's window and cracked the window open. Well, everybody else on the baseball field scattered except you. You walked over to the neighbor's front door, knocked on the door and said, we're so sorry we broke your window. Can we have our baseball back? And I'll pay to replace your window.
Right.
This is the kind of story that tells you what kind of person you are. And again, it's all about business storytelling. And who do we do business with today? We do business with people we know, like, and trust.
Exactly.
So this is a really great reason to share a beginning story.
And so the story you shared with us was like a beginning story, the story about the Contessa.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. It was. Now, the third type of business story to use today is what I call an inspiring story. And these are the type of stories that leaders will use to inspire their team. Because people today want to know that what they do has value, that they have purpose, and they want to know that they're a part of something bigger than themselves. So as leaders, we certainly need to get that message across. Do that with inspiring stories. The fourth type of story is called the value story. And these are stories that are going to convince potential customers and clients that your product or your service has value. Now, again, these are not stories where you're trying to sell them something. You're not going to tell a story about how fabulous your perfume is and where you get your ingredients. We only get them from Portugal, Spain. No, it's not about that at all. These are stories about your product and service and how that product or service has helped or improved someone's life.
Okay.
You're not trying to sell. You're trying to indicate value.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and the fifth one is what I call the customer story. Now, these are stories that you're not telling. These are stories your customer is telling about your product or your service. These are not testimonials. They're not testimonials, people saying, oh, how wonderful it was. It made all my clothes white beyond compare. No, these are going to be stories about how your product or service helped that person or improve their life. So those are the 5 types of stories to be working with in business.
So I would imagine that when a business leader contacts you with a goal in mind of why they want to tell their story, there's a lot of digging that you have to do with them to figure out which of these stories and how to best tell it.
Absolutely, Wendy. You're dead on there.
So would you share with us like some of your biggest successes with kind of getting to the meat of that?
Well, let me back up a little bit because you are dead on with that. When I work one-on-one with my clients, there's a particular event or happening where they need to make a presentation. And usually their team says, you need to tell a story. And most people I start working with, they don't understand story. They don't know about business story. And they usually start by saying, I don't have any stories. I don't have stories to tell. I'm not an interesting person. Nothing has happened to me. And of course, that's just ridiculous because we all have stories. But again, I understand that. To you, it doesn't seem like a story because it was your life. You lived through it. So it might not even register with you as something important to share. So yes, I go through exercises because we have to find an appropriate story. You're using stories strategically. There's a reason to tell the story. What kind of story? So it has to be appropriate. And of course, it has to be story worthy. There are plenty of stories that will just bore the socks off of everyone. Well, we're not going to be working with that kind of story.
Right.
So, but that's one of the first hurdles that I have to overcome with my clients. And another one is most of the CEOs, vice presidents I work with will say, I don't want to share a story. Story is nothing but fluff. I want to share my numbers, my statistics, how much money we made last year. And so I start to educate them. I love what I do. I love seeing the light bulbs go off. So the first thing I have to do is allow them to understand why they want to use story. So when they come to me, they say, look, I want to share all my numbers, my statistics. We beat our competition by this much. No. So the thing is, story is much more important than data. So I tell them, you do want to tell a story. You're not going to want to share your data because, for one thing, no one's going to remember all those numbers and statistics. But here's the real reason. Your story is more important than data, because data can only be understood within context. Your story is the context. If you don't share that with your listeners, no one is going to understand. But again, no one's going to remember those numbers and facts.
Right. Isn't it Maya Angelou that said people won't remember what you said or whatever, but they'll remember how you made them feel? And
Yes,
so the story will leave that impression, right?
Well, that is Maya Angelou. She was just amazing. Yes. Well, that's one of the reasons that story is so powerful, because story includes emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what she was alluding to. People remember how you made them feel.
Yeah.
If you cannot connect with your listeners on an emotional as well as an intellectual level, you're not a storyteller. You're a lecturer.
Mm.
So if you leave out emotion, you don't have story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but that's what we were starting with. So many people are just really confused and don't understand what story actually is. Now, let me share an example with you and your listeners.
Please.
Here's an example. What if I shared this with you? She put on her emerald green dress, stepped into her black stiletto heels, selected the perfect hat for the occasion, strapped the kids into the backseat of the car, and drove off toward downtown. Now, when I was sharing that with you, you weren't simply sitting there listening. Right. This is one of the reasons story is so powerful. You were creating an image of that woman inside of your mind.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons story is so powerful is story is co-created. Now, your image will never match my image. Now, when you were listening to that, what kind of hat did that woman place on her head?
When I was listening, it was one of those great big, I can't show it all here. One of those great big hats, the black bow around it. It was gorgeous.
Yeah, there you go. You had the image of the hat. And that's not the hat that I was talking about, because the hat that woman put on her head was a Christmas hat.
Oh.
That day she was driving her two daughters downtown to see the Christmas decorations.
Oh.
But it happened in your mind.
It did.
That's why we remember stories, because every human will have that picture of that story inside of their head, and we will remember stories.
Which also helps me understand why she put the kids in the car, because I was thinking in her stiletto heels, and why is she suddenly throwing the kids in the car?
Yeah, your mind was already starting to
right.
work with that. Well,
Yeah.
But I want to be very clear with you and all your listeners, because what I shared with you then is not story. It doesn't come anywhere close to being story. Now, it could be story, but it's going to take an awful lot of work. What I shared was simply a series of events. Mm-hmm. That is not story. That's just one of the examples of what people are calling story. They don't actually have a story. So yeah, there's a lot of educating I do when I start working with the people that I consult with, because I want them to thoroughly understand story. So we have a lot of work to do.
Oh, I can imagine. And then when you're trying to help them come up with a story that relates to the business or the speech that they're going to give, does the story just have to be a business story, or are they supposed to bring something from their personal life, that happened not related to the business?
Well, that's one of the reasons I love my work. Every story is unique. So I'm never bored. So of course we have to start with the situation. Maybe the CEO is giving a presentation to investors. Maybe he's just giving a presentation at a dinner. He's going to stand up and share something after dinner. So every situation is unique. So the answer to that is always going to be different. But you want to start with, what do you want your listeners to be thinking and feeling after your story? In business, you need to know why you're telling the story.
Yeah.
It's not to entertain people. There's a specific reason you're going to share a story.
So Faye, do you help them weave the story and build the whole presentation as well?
I definitely work with their story. Now, everyone I work with must tell a true story. We're not going to be making things up, because I refuse to work with people who want to make things up. I will bow out. No, it's a true story. You need to communicate the type of person you are. This is a true story that we're dealing with. So when I work with clients on a consulting basis, they will write their story, but I will thoroughly edit it, and I'll critique it, and I'll work with them until they're comfortable, until it's a very, very excellent story.
I imagine there's some vulnerability that they have to deal with as well. Like, wow, these are my coworkers, these are investors. I mean, how vulnerable do they feel comfortable being telling these stories?
Exactly. That's one of the processes we have to go through, because of course every person is different. But I will point out to them, a lot of CEOs leave out humor. Well, you're going to have to captivate your listeners. That's the mark of a great story. There's a big difference between a story, a good story, and a great story. And I always assume that people want a great story. Well, you're going to need a great story to be competitive in today's workplace. But yes, we're going to have to start where they are. But as I was mentioning, most people leave out humor. Well, you don't ever want to do that. Doesn't matter how dark your story is. You want to include humor, and there are certain points where you need to do that. But yeah.
Yeah, and I would always say, I'm a terrible joke teller, though.
I worked with one CEO, and she said, I don't have a sense of humor. I never know when someone's telling me a joke. I just laugh because everyone around me is laughing. I thought, oh boy. So I was like, well, that's interesting.
Well, I get the joke usually, but I don't always remember the punchline. So that's always a problem. There's a question that's come in from Kathy, and she says, how can boomers share their life stories in more meaningful and compelling ways versus, oh yeah, you told me that same story 1,000 times? And how can we listen to their stories with a more open heart, open mind, and eagerness?
Well, you're talking about a different type of story than business story, because that story is called a legacy story. And so we're going to work with legacy stories in different ways. And it's going to be a much longer story than a story that you would tell in the business arena too. And that, of course, comes with all sorts of other challenges to it. As far as being more open to listen, I really don't have any kind of answer for that. I'm always very intrigued when someone says, okay, I'm going to tell you a story. And it won't take you very long to figure out whether or not you want to be listening to the story. So it's either going to captivate your listener, and that's a big challenge. You've got to keep your listener with you from your first word right through the very end, or it's not going to be a good story.
So that's interesting that you said legacy stories are longer. Is there a correct length for a business story?
No. Now, you don't want to go much over 5 or 6 minutes. But again, every situation is unique and it's going to be different. But you don't want to drone on and on. Most people are going to lose their listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And, attention spans today, they're very, very short. So you might have been able to keep them with you 20 years ago, but today you just can't. So keep it about 5, maybe 6 minutes.
Yeah. And I think, Kathy, again, to go back to her listening question, it's not always easy, especially when you're in a big audience and, there's a lot of distractions. But I think when you're talking to somebody one-on-one, we tend to get into this habit of thinking about our answers or our next question or how we want to respond. And if we can slow that down enough, like I love to do with my guests, and just hear what you're saying, and that will compel me to be like, oh, well, now I'm curious, like you're curious, Faye, so tell me more about that. So maybe that's an idea, Kathy, to just stay curious and listen to what they're saying and think about, well, what does that mean to me? So just a thought. So a success, Faye, tell me about one of your clients that maybe it was the one who had no sense of humor, but one of your clients who thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be a challenge, and their story turned out to be very successful.
Well, several years ago, I worked with a woman who opened a bakery. And her bakery was really having a tough time getting off the ground. She was afraid she might have to close it. So she heard about me through a friend and contacted me. And she had a website. And on her website, she said, here's our story. And her story was what a lot of people think business storytelling is. Her story was something like, I opened this a year and a half ago, and we decided we would focus on women. And we offer cakes, we offer pastries, we offer cupcakes, we offer croissant, we offer coffee, we offer tea. And that is what we call a data dump. That's not a story. It's not anywhere near a story. It's a data dump, and people aren't going to remember that. And it's not going to get many people's attention either. So I worked with her, and on her website, we changed it. So here's my story, and it was an actual story. And her story, why she wanted to start the bakery, was absolutely wonderful. She grew up in Honduras, and her grandmother had a little cart that she would wheel around the city, and she sold one muffin. But this muffin was incredibly delicious. That's all she sold, was this one muffin. And that was part of her story. That's why she wanted to go into baking. That's how she got interested. Her grandmother taught her how to bake. And that was her signature product. So after we finished writing her story, we had it up on their website. People would drive across city to come, and they'd ask for that muffin. She offered all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But that was an actual story.
And they could feel her passion with that.
Well, got people interested. They knew how her bakery was different from other bakeries.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a real success.
Mm-hmm.
And the last time I spoke with her, she was moving into a space 3 times the size of the original one she moved into when she opened. So it was a powerful, powerful thing.
Yeah. Powerful stories. I mean,
without being salesy.
Right, because they could relate. They could, like your story about the hat, right? They could picture the grandmother with the cart and the bakery and the muffin.
Well, it means something.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone knew how much that meant to the owner of the bakery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how long have you been like coaching people, counseling, consulting with people to tell stories? And how do they find you? Let's do that.
I've had my own business for 22 years. So I've been doing this for 22 years. And how people can find me. They can go to my website, which is simply fayefulton.com. And they can find me on LinkedIn, which again will be Faye Fulton, and I'll come up. And you can also follow me on Instagram. And on Instagram, it's at Faye Fulton _speaker. Now, something I'd like to share with your listeners is one of the skills storytellers need to be very strong in is vocabulary. Storytellers need a vivid vocabulary. And what I'd like to share with you is on my Instagram, every Tuesday, I share a vocabulary word, and it's a storytelling technique. And what I mean is I share my definition of the story, of the word. You won't find that definition in any dictionary. It's my definition of the word.
Okay.
So sometimes when you're telling a story, you'll use the word, but other times, instead of using the word, you simply share your definition of the word. So if you follow me on Instagram, you'll see a vocabulary word every Tuesday. And that's the storytelling technique, because that's one of the skills people need to be very strong in.
So you're helping. I know that I see you on Instagram all the time. I don't know how to use it that well, but yeah, so that's a nice little tool and tip for us.
Well, storytellers need precise language and wonderful phrasing. You know, in your story, you could say, I lost my self-confidence. But in your story, you could also say, my confidence showed up dusty and moth-eaten.
Ooh.
There's a huge difference. And which one do you think your listeners will be more interested in hearing? Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what, Faye? Thank you for that example, because when I think about business stories, I would think more clear, right? I lost my self-confidence, as opposed to what sounds more like something you'd read in a novel, but it is so much more vivid.
Oh, it's so much more interesting.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, the neurological science about storytelling is fascinating, but the brain is always searching for something new and unique. And that's when you start to pay attention. So instead of just saying, I lost my self-confidence, if you deliver that message in the other form, your brain's going to go, oh, because I never heard it like that before.
Right.
I never heard anyone say, my self-confidence showed up dusty and moth-eaten. It's the same message. We know what we mean, but it's so much more interesting, and you'll get your listeners' attention.
And so much more fun for the speaker too.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah. So Faye, I always like to end my interviews with a quote from C.S. Lewis, where he said, we are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. So my question to you is, what are your dreams for the next 6 to 9 months?
Well, 2020 was such a strange year for everyone. So for 2021, I am just waiting for live speaking engagements. You know, as a keynote speaker, I speak in front of large groups of people at conferences, associations, meetings, and I just can't wait to get back out there again, because Zoom is just a whole different ballpark. It's just not the same at all. Yeah. So I am really hoping that sometime in 2021, we'll be able to start meeting and have live speaking engagements again.
I hope so too. Thank you. Thank you for all of this, Faye. A lot of positive comments about what you shared and the inspiration that you left the audience with. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show, Wendy. I'm just delighted to be here.
Such a pleasure. So let me tell you about my guest for next week. She recently wrote a book called How Seniors Are Saving the World: Retirement Activists to the Rescue. And she herself is an awesome woman. Her name is Thelma Reese. And Thelma was born in 1933, and she has been active for a very long time, And in so many ways, you're going to love her story. She was in the field of education and literacy for a very long time. She's written a couple of other books about senior men and senior women whose titles I don't remember right off the bat. But I think it's going to be an inspiring, fun, entertaining, and educational interview. So I hope you all will join me when Thelma is here next week. And thank you all for your wonderful comments and for joining us today. Let's meet again next week to share, to grow, to continue to build this community. And my name is Wendy Green, and this has been Hey Boomer.